Welcome back, everyone. We've got a really interesting deep dive for you today. You guys have been digging into some fascinating stuff about Iceland and NATO, and let me tell you, it's a bit of a head scratcher.
It really is.
We're talking about a country with no standing army that's a founding member of a military alliance.
You don't see that every day.
Not exactly. So we've got historical records, political analysis, and even some public opinion polls to try and figure this out. We're going to try to see how Iceland ended up in this really unique position with NATO.
Yeah, I mean, this really gets to the heart of what it means to be a small nation in a world full of these big alliances.
Okay, so let's break it down. First things first, how does a country with no army even become a founding member of NATO? I mean, that just seems kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does seem a little strange, at first glance. But you got to think about the historical context. This is 1949, the beginning of the Cold War. The whole geopolitical landscape was changing rapidly, and Iceland, despite being neutral, had a strategically important position in the North Atlantic, right between North America and Europe.
So it was all about location.
Location, location, location.
Oh.
Control of the North Atlantic was crucial, especially for the United States, and that's where the 1951 defense agreement between Iceland and the U.S. comes in. Essentially, the U.S. agreed to basically handle Iceland's defense, which allowed Iceland to join NATO without having to create their own military.
So they outsourced their defense. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that kind of strategy for Iceland?
Well, the main advantage is obvious, right? You get security guarantees from a superpower. But on the flip side, it definitely raises these big questions about autonomy and dependence. How much control does Iceland actually have over its own security when it's relying entirely on another country? That's been a big debate ever since.
For sure. And I imagine not everyone in Iceland was exactly thrilled about having a U.S. military base right there on their soil.
Oh, absolutely not. The decision to join NATO was actually made by the Alþingi, their parliament, not by a public referendum. It was a close vote, too, and let me tell you, public opinion was deeply, deeply divided.
So the people of Iceland didn't even get a direct say in a decision that completely reshaped their country's security. That's a pretty significant omission in terms of a democratic process, wouldn't you say?
Oh, for sure. It raised eyebrows back then, and it still kind of does. The protests against joining NATO were massive, even leading to riots in Reykjavik.
Riots. What were people so worried about that it led to that kind of reaction?
Well, a lot of people felt like joining NATO was basically throwing away their long-standing neutrality and potentially dragging them into wars they wanted no part of. This was made even worse when the police, who were helped by volunteers from the Independence Party, used tear gas to break up the protests.
Hold on. Volunteers from a political party were acting like law enforcement. That's just unheard of in most democratic countries. And using tear gas against protesters is, well, it's a pretty serious escalation. Sounds like a really intense time.
It was. And to add even more drama, a prominent member of the Socialist Party, who were totally against joining NATO, claimed their leader was being held hostage inside the parliament building during the vote.
Wow, that's a serious accusation. Looking back on all of this, it makes you wonder if Iceland's entry into NATO was truly democratic, especially with no public referendum.
Yeah, it's a valid question, but we got to remember the geopolitical realities at the time, right? The Cold War was getting more intense, and smaller countries like Iceland were caught in the middle.
Yeah, I get that. But wasn't there also an economic aspect to all of this? Did Iceland have any financial incentive to join NATO?
Well, the Marshall Plan is important here. Remember, that was the massive U.S. aid program to help rebuild Europe after World War II. Well, Iceland, even though they weren't directly damaged during the war, got the highest per capita aid out of any recipient nation.
Really? It kind of makes you wonder if all that aid was a strategic move by the U.S. Did it sway Iceland's decision on joining NATO and accepting the Keflavik base? Was it a way for the U.S. to secure their interests in the North Atlantic?
Well, that's a big question that historians are still debating. There's definitely a case to be made that the Marshall Plan aid, along with the economic benefits of hosting the Keflavik base, maybe sweeten the deal for Iceland.
So it's a bit of a quid pro quo. The U.S. gets a strategically important base, and Iceland gets economic support and security guarantees.
It's messy, no easy answers.
Yeah.
But it shows how economics and security concerns are all tangled up in international relations.
For sure. So remind me, when did the Keflavik base close?
2006. President Bush pulled U.S. forces out. Some Icelandic officials weren't happy about it, worried about the economic hit, especially for the town of Keflavik. They'd become pretty dependent on the base being there. I can imagine. Must have been a tough transition. So We've got this whole context of Iceland's relationship with NATO now. Are there any other times where these dynamics came into play?
Well, there's one event that stands out, and it's a really controversial one. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Iceland, even though they had no military to send, was listed as part of a coalition of the willing.
Wait, no military, but part of a military coalition? How does that even work? What did that mean for Iceland?
That's what we'll get into next.
You were saying something about Iceland in the Iraq War.
Right, right. So Iceland being in the coalition of the willing, even though they couldn't actually send any troops, it caused a lot of controversy, both in Iceland and internationally. A lot of people saw it as just a symbolic thing, a way for the U.S. to, look like they had more support for the war, which, let's face it, wasn't that popular.
Yeah, it is strange to include a country that couldn't actually contribute any soldiers. So what did Iceland say about why they joined?
Well, the prime minister at the time, Davy Oddsson, said it was part of their obligation to NATO.
But then a top U.S. official basically contradicted that, saying that being in NATO didn't mean you had to be in the Iraq War.
Yeah.
They even pointed to France, another NATO member, and they chose not to join the coalition.
So Iceland didn't have to be involved, but they chose to side with this controversial war anyway.
That's interesting. It makes you think about, the pressure Iceland might be under as a NATO member and how much their foreign policy really lines up with, what's best for them.
Absolutely. And remember, this was a time when people were really divided about the Iraq War, really divided. A lot of Icelanders felt like their government was siding with the U.S. and not actually listening to them.
It sounds like another example of a smaller country caught in the middle of a power struggle between bigger countries. Did this whole thing lead to any soul-searching in Iceland about being in NATO? Oh, definitely. It added fuel to the fire, for sure. In fact, the Ríkislögreglustjóri, that's Iceland's National Commissioner of Police, they did an assessment and concluded that Iceland being in NATO, especially after the whole coalition of the willing thing, actually made Iceland less safe.
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement. What was their logic there?
Their argument was that by, being so close to the U.S. and taking part in these controversial military actions, Iceland was putting a target on its back, basically. Anyone who didn't like U.S. foreign policy or what NATO was doing could see Iceland as an enemy.
Right, so even though Iceland has no army and has always been neutral, being in NATO could actually make them more vulnerable.
Exactly. And it's not just about, direct military attacks either. Think about what's happening in the world right now, the war in Ukraine, all the tension between Russia and the West. People are worried that Iceland's infrastructure, like those underwater cables, could be sabotaged.
Oh, right. Those cables are super important for communication and internet access, right?
Hugely important. They carry tons of data, and they're how Iceland connects to the rest of the world. If those cables were cut, it'd be a huge blow to their economy and everything.
So being geographically isolated and not having a military doesn't mean Iceland is safe, especially now as part of NATO and given the current geopolitical situation.
Exactly. And this brings us back to a big question. Does being in NATO actually protect Iceland, or does it put them at risk?
That's a tough one. Seems like a really tricky balancing act. How much power does Iceland actually have within NATO anyway? Do they really get a say in what the alliance does?
Right. Well, in theory, NATO is supposed to be all about consensus. Every member gets an equal vote.
Yeah.
But it's not that simple. Countries with big armies and strong economies, they kind of get to call the shots.
So where does that leave Iceland? Do they really have any influence when it comes to the big decisions?
Hard to say for sure. But there was this one incident that really shows how a country like Iceland could get dragged into a conflict even if they don't want to be.
Are you talking about that missile that hit Poland in 2022?
Yeah, that one. Remember, at first, nobody knew where the missile came from. Ukraine immediately blamed Russia and wanted NATO to trigger Article 5, the collective defense clause.
Yeah, I remember that. It felt like the world was about to go to war. But then it turned out the missile was actually Ukrainian, right?
Right. If the NATO leaders hadn't been careful and really looked into it, they might have triggered Article 5 based on bad information.
Which would have meant all NATO members, including Iceland, would have to respond. That could have meant war with Russia for Iceland.
Exactly. Iceland would have been obligated to fight even though they have no army, and they could have faced retaliation for a conflict they didn't even start.
That's a scary thought. Really shows the risks for Iceland being in NATO, especially now with all this global tension. Makes you wonder, are there other options for Iceland to stay safe without all this risk?
Well, nobody's ever officially left NATO, but there is a way to do it if they wanted. It's in the treaty.
So Iceland could just leave. How would that work?
Article 13 of the North Atlantic Treaty says a member can leave by giving 1 year's notice.
I bet that would be a huge decision. Tons of implications for Iceland's relationships with other countries and their whole security strategy.
Absolutely.
Huh.
But it's not their only option. There are other ways Iceland could work with NATO without being a full member.
Really? Like what? Could they do certain things with NATO but not be bound by that collective defense part?
Yeah, there are a couple of programs just for that. One is called the Partnership for Peace. It's pretty flexible, lets countries choose the areas they want to work on.
Oh, okay. So they could pick and choose what parts of NATO they want. What else?
There's also these things called individually tailored partnership programs, more focused agreements with specific goals.
So Iceland could maybe work with NATO on like cybersecurity or maritime security, but not have to send troops if there's a war.
Exactly. These programs give Iceland a way to be involved with NATO on their own terms, contributing to international security, but staying more independent and less likely to get pulled into conflicts that aren't a direct threat to them.
Sounds like there's a lot to think about for Iceland and other countries in similar situations. Before we dive deeper into those other options and what Iceland's relationship with NATO might look like in the future, let's go back to something we talked about earlier, that U.S. military base in Keflavik.
Yeah, the base that really shaped how Iceland relates to both the U.S. and NATO.
You mentioned some historians think that the base wasn't really necessary for Iceland's safety, and the fact that it closed without any major security problems for Iceland kind of supports that idea.
Interesting point. If the base wasn't crucial for Iceland, then why was it even there for so long? What was the point of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And now, with all this global tension, there's this new worry about Iceland being a target for sabotage. It's almost like it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Having the base and now being in NATO might have made Iceland more of a target, not safer.
It's complicated for sure. Deep historical roots and real consequences today. Iceland's story really shows the tough choices small countries have to make in a world where big powers are always competing.
We'll be back in a moment. We're back. And, thinking about everything we've discussed about Iceland and NATO, I keep coming back to the people who actually live there.
Right, it's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff, but there are real people whose lives are shaped by these decisions.
Exactly. So what do Icelanders think about being in NATO now? There must be a lot of different opinions.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really divided issue. Some people see NATO as, like, their lifeline, especially with everything going on in the world right now. They feel safer being part of it. But others think it's outdated, like something from the Cold War that's not relevant anymore. They think Iceland would be better off on its own.
Yeah, that makes sense. It must be tough trying to figure out what's best for everyone with such strong feelings on both sides.
Definitely. And this whole debate is probably going to keep going, as the world changes.
It's interesting how Iceland's story kind of challenges the way we usually think about security.
In what way?
Well, usually when we talk about security, we think about armies and alliances and, projecting power. But Iceland has been safe and independent for centuries without a military. They've relied more on diplomacy, staying neutral, and working with other countries.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Iceland shows that there are other ways to be secure that don't involve just military strength.
And that's especially important now, I think. We've got these new threats like cyber attacks, climate change, and pandemics. These aren't things you can solve with just an army, We need to be working together, finding new solutions, thinking globally.
For sure. Iceland's focus on diplomacy and finding peaceful solutions could be a good example for other countries.
It makes you wonder if the future of security is less about building walls and more about building trust. Maybe it's about strengthening those global connections and working together to solve problems that affect us all.
That's a hopeful way to look at it. And in a way, that's what Iceland is trying to do,
Yeah, I agree. They're committed to peace, and they're always willing to talk things out, even when there are disagreements. It's pretty inspiring.
It shows that even small countries can have a big impact when it comes to making the world a more peaceful place.
Well said. So, as we wrap up, here's something to think about. As the world gets more and more connected, and the lines between, what's happening inside a country and what's happening globally get blurry, will alliances like NATO still be important? Or will we need new ways of working together that go beyond just national borders?
That's a really big question. There are no easy answers, but it's something we all need to be thinking about as we move forward.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Iceland's journey with NATO. We hope this has given you a new perspective on the challenges and opportunities for smaller nations in a world where power is constantly shifting. And keep in mind, learning never stops. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.
Until next time.
Fínn fundur, mjög góður.
Bara verið ekki mögulegt forstjórnarboð Katrínar Jakobsdóttur?
Það er bara að góma, það er ekki hægt að segja annað.
Verða breytingar á ríkisstjórn?
Það kemur allir ljós.
Ertu svo frá Bessastæði?
Ég sé ykkur seinna. Hvar er ég nú með minn bíl?
Þú ert að fara til vinstri frá mig góð?
Já, þarna ert þú. Þakka þér fyrir, ætlar að fylgja mér svo ég rati.